let's say this financial advice. I go and I'm getting ready for retirement, and I need to know, okay, well, what should I do with my $3 million retirement account? How should I structure this thing to provide me income? And I go into Grok or Gemini, and I ask it, and it spits out these results. And okay, who's going to help you implement? That requires action, requires human action. So at some point, the rubber has to hit the road, and the wheels have to spin.
Yeah,
you can't just have this calculation and this text. That's all it's doing, is giving you text. It's giving you directions. You need to have someone that actually takes that recipe and bakes it.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned, you talked about the DIY folks before, and DIY is fine. Now, my belief is that DIY investors are actually kind of missing the point. As a DIY investor, it's not that you can, it's the value isn't necessarily that you now don't need an advisor. The value is actually that you have enough wherewithal to sniff out a good versus a bad advisor. You can make sure you hire a good advisor. Here we go.
Welcome to the Money Alchemist podcast. I'm your host, Ben.
And I'm Brent. And we are here to talk about competition in the financial planning space, really.
Yeah, the future of advice.
The future of advice. The reason that this came about is if you've listened, we have another episode where we talk about some recent shifts in the real estate industry that are causing, that are forcing realtors and clients to negotiate the commissions for selling a house. And I recently bought a house, and I'm in the process of selling a house, and I actually had to have this negotiation with my realtor, which was a little interesting. And it made me think, there's so much about the future of financial advice that is already really in motion that I think kind of echoes with what's starting to happen in the real estate space, because years ago, well, not so long ago, realtors, the commissions are pretty much set. You get a realtor, you pay the commission. It was kind of expected. Well, now that there's a negotiation to go on, I think realtors are going to have to start thinking, what am I doing more that somebody else isn't? What am I doing to be worth the percentage that we're negotiating to? And bringing this back to financial advice, I think everybody listening to this is probably familiar with Vanguard. Vanguard launched the first retail index fund in 1976 with its S&P 500 fund.
Took a while for that to catch on, didn't it?
And that was really the beginning of kind of challenging the value of what does an advisor really do and why are we paying you? And to me, that seed that has had now 40 plus years to grow has really actually driven more value for clients.
Yeah. So I think it'd be worthwhile to take a tour down history lane here and look at how the financial advice world evolved. So retirement in its current day's form did not exist in the 1800s. It didn't even really exist in the 1900s. Social Security wasn't even around till 1936. I think is when the Social Security Act was signed into law. This concept of retirement saving for retirement was born, and a lot of people were left destitute in the 20s and 30s because the farm was no longer the primary source of making a living. So they had to come up with a solution, and that was the Social Security Act. But then, Social Security was never designed to be an entire income replacement. It was just a supplement to it, and so so out of that was born this retirement business, this retirement advice business, and it continued to evolve.
Think about all of the companies that really launched around that. You think about Fidelity and Vanguard. Some of the largest institutions we have in financial services today are born in that period of time.
Yeah, and it all stems from economic specialization. That we most of us are no longer farmers. We're no longer on a family farm. We all do like individual, very specific things. And like you ask me, my wife and I, we try to do gardening every year. Our garden is pitiful. Like if my family's ability to eat depended on my skills as a farmer, we would have died because I can't even get my green bean plants to grow. I think we finally concluded there's just not enough sun. Anyway, we've decided, my wife and I together, we've decided that we're done gardening. This was our last year. We're going to leave the fruit plants in there because they're
I bet you next year you buy something.
They're perennials, but we'll see. But anyway, moving on. But financial advice really did not exist in today's form 20, 30 years ago. It was very transactional in nature. It started with like insurance companies, actually,
Well, if going back again, from the 30s, you had Social Security. Well, then companies started to create pension plans. Mm-hmm. And so you had this notion of retirement. Well, in the 1970s, the 401k was created.
Fun fact, the first pension plan was actually developed by the railroad. And it was essentially a kind of a Ponzi scheme. Or a generational Ponzi scheme where the railroad didn't even fund it. They just paid for it out of current cash flows. And
isn't that what the Social Security system does?
Well, yeah, it's a generational Ponzi scheme, if we're being honest, but it's, it's the reason why it's
transfer
okay.
Tax.
The reason why it's okay is because it's organized by the government, which has the ability to print.
You just call it a transfer tax.
Yeah, whatever, call it what you will. But essentially, it's a pension plan that's funded by the next generation. It's funded with present cash flows, not historic cash flows. So back to the whole railroad pension system. There was a couple failures, and it ended up being a big disaster, as you can see. And then I think in ultimately culminated to 1976. Ford passed the ERISA Act, which kind of really brought modern retirement planning in its current form into scope. And that's where you get this the term qualified plans, like 401k plans, 457 plans, things like that. But anyway, I don't want to go too much into the weeds on that. It used to be back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was this very transactional relationship with a so-called financial advisor. I don't even think they were called financial advisors. They were called brokers. In fact, you remember that movie with Will Smith, Pursuit of Happiness?
Yeah.
Excellent movie. But he works for, was it Paine-Webber?
Watt Allen Reed or something?
It was one of these old school brokers. I forget who it was. So one of the listeners is going to know, and they're going to be screaming at the top of their lungs. But I can't remember the exact broker he worked with. As soon as you say it, it's going to.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Anyway, but he would call his clients and he would sell them 100 shares of Microsoft, 100 shares of whatever, you name the security. And that would be the extent of the relationship. You would take the order from the customer, give it to the trade desk, and that was it. You didn't know what this. You kind of didn't know what the guy did for a living, or gal, whoever was on the other end, your client, but you didn't even have their social security number. You didn't have their birth dates. I mean, it was just very transactional. And then, brokers got really wealthy because the markups were high. I don't know what the commission was, but it wasn't cheap. There was high markups because there was no, there was no electronic way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then
you didn't have a fidelity.com you can log into and place a trade.
I don't know who did it first, but one of these companies, either Scottrade, E-Trade, one of these companies came out with the discount trade model. And remember, it was $19.95 a trade back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And that was the deal. You're like, oh my God, $20 for a trade. Where do I sign? So you had these discount brokers that came online, and then that forced actual brokers that were living in the that high markup world to differentiate themselves. They say, okay, well, I don't want to lose my clients, I don't want to lose my job, so what do I do? Well, you have to add value. So then that's where you get managed money, and then managed money was born out of that environment. Fast forward to 2010 or so, I forget when the whole robo advice platform came out, but then that further commoditized what managed money means. Anyway, along this way, a long time ago, when was it, the 80s? When was the CFP curriculum founded?
I believe the 80s.
Yeah, I think it was like the early to mid 80s. I should know this. But
1985.
1985. So, the idea of a fiduciary working with a financial planner had existed since 1985, probably predates that. But it didn't really gain in popularity until it became economically necessary for a lot of financial professionals to embrace that model, because it's a lot more work.
Right.
It's a lot more work for
to
the
not
same
have
amount
to
of
just
money.
sell something. You actually have to deliver advice and take down a lot of data and have a lot of
You have
meetings.
to make a difference.
Right.
You have to provide a human value that is difficult to be commoditized. And it really is. Financial planning is very difficult to commoditize. But we're seeing that change now.
But investment management is not as difficult to commoditize.
Oh, it's a commodity. I mean,
right.
S&P and chill.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it really is that simple.
Right.
If you can do it, that takes a lot of wherewithal. It takes a lot of patience and a lot of ability to leave things be. I think humans have a tendency to intervene. You ever sat down or been next to someone else at a grill and a cookout, and they just can't stop flipping the steaks? You're like, oh my God, just stop flipping the steaks. You're going to overcook them. You're overdoing it. Like that's human nature, is that we just want to mess with things too much. And so there's a behavioral component to adding a financial advisor to the S&P and chill strategy that I think does add value. But that's just one component.
Well, and I think this is what Vanguard, with the introduction of the index fund, which, by the way, used to be whatever you paid an advisor or a broker, that's fine. Vanguard's index fund, when it was released, the expense on it was a little under 0.5%. It's now like 0.03%, I think. So, I mean, the fees have even come down on the index funds. But the fact is, with you saying S&P and chill, there's this notion that if you just buy the broader stock market and stay invested and leave your money alone, you're actually going to do better performance-wise than having somebody picking and choosing all the individual companies. And I think the data historically has played out to largely support that, which is what Vanguard really capitalized on with the invention of the index fund. And back to your point, it forced advisors to say, well, then what the heck am I actually here to do? If picking stocks and managing the okay, so now you have a discount broker, so you don't need to call me to place the trade. And now we've admitted that, like, as collective, stock pickers, we're not really that much better than just owning the broader market. The question becomes like, okay, what is it that I do? And so, in the beginning of my career, so I started in this industry in like 2011, 2012, and the robo-advisor was just taking off. And for anybody listening, a robo-advisor is it's a technology that essentially automatically invests and rebalances and manages your portfolio. People were talking about the advisory business falling by the wayside because of the robo-advisor. Clients are just going to hire robo-advisors. And really, with the clients that I work with, there's so much more to the value of the advice than like, what stock do we buy? There's coaching on every level, from how you manage financial transactions in your life, how you manage your behaviors, how you set yourself up in your career, how you set yourself up, in retirement. And so you ultimately become less of, a stock picker and less of a broker and more of, maybe a financial life coach.
Yeah, it's more about not which stock should you buy, but should you buy a stock? You know what I'm saying? Like having a relationship close enough with another human being that knows you well enough and knows your goals, knows, what makes you tick, what do you dislike, what keeps you on the rails, what gets you off the rails. For some of the people I work with, that means buying the S&P 500, nothing else. That's it. That's what keeps them on the rails, keep fees to a minimal. and just keep them on the average standard path. Some, they want to have exposure to individual stocks. They like that extra kick. They like that excitement. They like to be paying attention to the earnings reports. So that's what it's about. It's not, should I pick stocks to try to outperform an index, because that requires one to tell the future. To be crystal clear, this is not a conversation of what should you buy. Should you be an index investor? Should you be an active investor? Really, I think
you should invest.
Yes. The point is you should invest, and you should invest in things that you're inclined to keep. So if you're a firm believer in index, low cost, passive management, that's where you should be. If you think, you know what, I want to pick and choose the stocks because I want to have some agency over my portfolio, then that's what you should choose. The bottom line is you should be invested. Now, you should be diversified. I'm a believer in diversification.
So it's funny. So one of the common questions that we get from clients is, my kid, I want to invest money for my kid, right? I've got a child, they're, let's say 18 years old or 20 years old, and they're thinking about investing. What should they invest in? And, I think what's interesting is that a lot of times that question is coming from a place of like, where can they make the most money? But the reality is like a 20-year-old with the amount of money that you're investing, like let's say you take $1,000 and you put it in a stock and you triple it. It's great to make $2,000, but it's not going to make or break your life, right? What is starting to develop the right behaviors and starting to, kind of, it's like learning to ride a bike. You have to ride with training wheels at first. And when, I don't know about you, but when I was 20 and I personally, I bias towards indexes at this point. But when I was younger, if you had just said, hey, go buy an S&P 500 fund, that would not have got me excited. Like I wouldn't have been interested in that. But as a sophomore in college or a junior in college, the idea of buying Apple or the idea of buying like one of these companies that played a role in my life, that was a lot cooler. And the value of that was less like how much did that Apple stock make? It was more like it motivated me to save money. All of a sudden, when I had a little bit of extra money in my pocket, there was like another thing that could be on the list besides like going and getting something at the store. I was like, wait a second, there is this stock that I've been wanting to go buy. Maybe I could do that. And so it encouraged saving and investing. And my belief is that was worth a lot more money than any one of those individual stocks that I bought. So the point is, when I get asked this question, it's really back to your thing. Get them, like invest them in something that's interesting to them so that they actually want to talk to you about it. And maybe they actually find it interesting and exciting to save money instead of a chore. Because if you make it a chore, you're going to, it can be tough.
Yeah, you're trying to tap into that person's reason, that person's purpose. Like your purpose when you were younger, young version Brent who didn't think the S&P 500 was that interesting. By the way, I still don't think it's that interesting. I think it's a boring. It's a lot more fun. It is a boring asset to own, but it's kind of supposed to be boring. It's the most vanilla of the choices that you have, but. And for that reason, it's a good cornerstone for a lot of portfolios. But back to young Brent, who didn't have that much to invest. What was actually the purpose? His purpose wasn't to try to multiply that savings so much as it was to build behavior.
No, I think 20-year-old Brent definitely wanted to make money. Like, there's no question.
Oh, that's always an interest.
That's the thing is like at the time, like I missed the forest for the trees, right? Like I remember I bought Domino's stock and I think I doubled my money. I made like $400 on Domino's stock in a couple of months. And I remember feeling so great about that. Right. And, but like that didn't really matter, but I that's not how I saw it when I was a 20-year-old. So bringing this back though, to the future of advice, advice comes in so many different shapes and sizes. And everybody's a little bit different. And I think as and we'll reference a study that we've kind of looked at later, but as we move forward in time, like to me, the advisors that can continue to, keep their profit margins up, if we think about it from a business standpoint, are the ones that can really get alongside, walk alongside their clients through these different life events and life stages and provide coaching and really be more of a partner than a transaction,
Yeah. So, I think the days of going to a financial advisor and just buying a product or a stock, it still exists, but it's a fraction of what it used to be in the 90s. That's kind of a dead business model. There's no financial advisors that are seriously building their practices.
I think I don't know if that's true. I think there's a lot of like insurance firms. I mean, one of the things that is happening in our industry is there's big discussion on who can call themselves a financial advisor. Mm-hmm. Like right now, there's not really like any regulatory definition or not any really official definition of what is a financial advisor. So you can be an insurance salesperson, mm-hmm. and you can go on LinkedIn and make all sorts of posts about, index universal life or, whatever life insurance product. And people can come to you and you can call yourself a financial advisor when in reality, you may be an insurance salesman, right? And those are two different things. So one of the things that I think is currently happening is we're starting to see definition to like who can call themselves a financial planner. Like when somebody asks you what you do for a living, mm-hmm. like what do you say?
It depends,
Financial planner, financial advisor, wealth manager. Like what the heck is the difference between any of these things, right? And I think over time, I think a consumer wants to know whether they're going to somebody that can comprehensively help them think through their wealth, or if they're going to somebody that is a 1099 employee for an insurance company that sells insurance products, right? But right now, those two people can't really call themselves anything different, right? They're both the same from a marketing standpoint.
Yeah, and trying to put myself in the shoes of a consumer, that's got to be incredibly confusing because you think of,
oh my gosh, yeah,
financial advisors being this ubiquitous term that applies equally to all these roles. But I guess
I was in public one time and this somebody asked me what I do, mm-hmm. and I said I'm a wealth manager, and they said, and I wasn't even trying to get business or anything like that. But they looked at me and they said, oh, I don't need a wealth manager. I need a financial advisor. And I looked at him and I said, what, like, hey, what's the difference in your mind? And they proceeded to tell me that they had found an advisor and walked into their office and he had made the recommendation to cash out a retirement account to buy life insurance. And she had left the meeting kind of confused about like, why did they tell me to cash my retirement out to go buy life insurance? And I told her, I said, well, you really talked to an insurance salesperson. She said, no. I talked to a financial advisor. And I said, no. You talked to an insurance salesperson. Like go on their website. Wow. And a lot of times this is what you can do. You can go on the website. You can scroll down to the bottom of the website. And if their branding is XYZ name, a company name with it, the bottom of the website, it says DBA XYZ name and insurance company. They actually work for that insurance company. Mm-hmm.
By the way, if any of you listening are getting advice to cash in a retirement plan to buy life insurance,
that may not
generally is not.
I don't want to say never.
I am trying to find a reason why that would be a good recommendation. But anyway, it's incredibly confusing for consumers. I guess the reason why I think that transactional business model is somewhat dead is because I just don't run into it a lot anymore. You do see it in insurance. That's true. But I'm trying to think maybe like a commodities broker is one that you see from time to time, but that's totally different business. So I just don't run into a lot of people who are working with a transactional only broker. It's still out there. Don't get me wrong. And I think you've definitely pointed that out. You ran into someone that was dealing with that. So, but moving into the future, to be an effective financial advisor in the more traditional sense, I think that you have to abandon this idea that you're some stock wizard and you're there to pick out, essentially to predict the future for customers. Because if we're all trying to, if we're just going to be candid about what we're trying to do when we're selecting individual investments, we're just trying to get the best return, risk adjusted. That's all we're trying to do. We're trying to predict the future to some degree. And I think the effective financial advisors that just more or less abandon that pursuit and adopt a more, buy and hold type of strategy and focus on the things that really do matter. Like like young Brent, he may have not realized this at the time, but the true value of your interest in investments was building behavior. And I think that's what good advisors will focus on, is that behavioral aspect to investing. But more importantly, and this is what you said you were going to bring up this McKinsey and Company study on North American wealth management in 2030 for those who want to follow. It's going to be the link to this is going to be in the show notes. But this study essentially reviews the changes that have taken place in the wealth management industry over the past 2 decades, and I've had a front seat to these. It's been pretty exciting, actually. And what they predict will happen between now and 2030, and it's very interesting. That they call it the Netflixification, the Netflixing or something. They use that. What is that term that they use?
Basically, I mean, it's kind of in line with what we've been talking about, which is this industry. They believe, and I think you and I have seen this, that the industry is going to shift from like one-time transactional fees to subscription services. Essentially, right?
Well, I mean, isn't that what a fee-based model is?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm saying is we really see this. Like, so for example, in my with our practice, I don't get paid any commissions at all. I can't take any referral fees, can't take commissions. The only fees that a client pays is either a percentage of the account that we manage or a flat fee that's debited from their bank account. And what's important about that is I don't get paid up front. I get paid on an ongoing basis. So you staying a client is just as important as you becoming a client. And that really, that aligns everybody because, in a commission-based model, you can really be incentivized to wine and dine until you bring the client on, and then you get paid, and then there's no residual, subscription. And so what can happen is that clients feel like they get a lot of attention before they become clients. And then once they've become a client, their attention kind of dies down, right?
Yeah, the advisor gets on the horseback and rides off into the sunset, never to be seen again.
So good financial advice isn't a point in time thing. The reality is when we build plans with clients, they're wrong. Okay. The study says that only 39% of affluent families have a written financial plan. And when I say that these plans are wrong, I don't mean that they're not valuable. They're actually incredibly valuable because there's data that shows that if you have a goal-based plan, if you have a process of kind of seeing and mapping out what happens, you're a better saver, you're more effective at achieving the goals, you have better process to make decisions. So the act of planning is incredibly valuable, but the plan itself is like absolutely going to be wrong a month from now.
Yeah.
Right. Because things change. And so a good advisor isn't just a one-time conversation. It's an ongoing relationship as your life changes, as you grow, as you shift to continually, with a lot of our clients, we use this analogy of flying the plane, right? When you're just getting started on saving, you're kind of taking off in the plane. And if you're flying from California to New York, it's not like all that important if you're flying towards North Carolina or New York. What's important at the beginning is that you're flying east, right? Like in California, you're flying east, you're going to be fine if you're trying to go to New York. Now, once you get to the East Coast, like you better be over New York and not North Carolina, right? And so our job, a lot of times, going back, thinking about that plane analogy, as a pilot takes off in the plane, the window at that front of that plane is really small, right? You're flying this plane really fast really long way with this little tiny window. And what do they use to compensate for that? They've got gauges and systems. Everything is in the plane to give them a sense for how fast am I going? How high am I in the air? Am I going up or down relative to land? What direction are we going, right? And the planning, kind of just like those gauges, gives you a really good sense. A storm can obviously pop up, right? And we may have to manage for that. But the reality is when we do land the plane, we want to land like close to New York and not in North Carolina.
Yeah, but no matter what, you always kind of want a human being in that pilot seat because, and I think that's what we're getting at with the future of advice, where right now we're seeing the mantra in a lot of these DIY spaces. And I've got nothing against DIY investors. I think it's a fantastic thing. But I do think that the vast majority of the population, they don't have the knowledge sets to properly invest and do financial planning. Financial planning is complicated. It's not easy to do. And if you've got a full-time job and you're not focused on all the ins and outs of money management, wealth management strategies, and I'm not just talking about what investments to pick. I'm talking about, how do you manage taxes? How do you
taxes, estate,
how much
insurance.
should you even be saving? What should you be what goals should you have? What's the purpose of your money? How much are you going to spend when you retire? What's inflation projected to be? What's your budget look like now, and how is it going to be different when you're retired? There's just so many variables, and I don't think the average person has their mind fully wrapped around that, but they are competent enough to get into the plane and take off and just head east, as you said. And that's what the S&P and chill strategy is. It is literally just that the only advice is get in the plane, take off, head east. That's the extent. That is the extent of that recommendation.
Minimize all the headwinds and fly as fast as you can.
But it lacks precision. Sure. It lacks precision. So when you get there, when you get east, how do you know you're over New York, or are you going to be over the Atlantic Ocean?
Right.
So you need someone to help guide you. And as you get closer to your goals, whether it be retirement, college is complicated, isn't it?
Oh my gosh.
There's nothing.
Who knows?
How does S&P and chill solve that? It doesn't. You have to have someone, an advocate that is knowledgeable in these areas that can help you land the plane. And that is where it is difficult for DIY solutions like that's why robo-advisors failed, honestly. And let's be honest, they failed. Robo-advice is okay, but I see it nothing more than a fancy target date fund,
Yeah.
But they are not, they stopped gaining traction because they lack that precision capability. And right now, human beings, good financial planners, have a corner in that market, but there's something throwing a curveball. You know where I'm going with this. Large language models. AI. That's changing everything. AI. So what does that going to do? Because I can literally go into, I like to use Grok. I use this Microsoft system sometimes. What is that one called? Copilot. I know a lot of people use Perplexity, which has been good. A lot of people use the Google version, which I forget what that one's called now. It used to be called Bard. Now it's something else. But anyway,
Gemini.
Gemini. You can go and ask these programs pretty specific financial advice questions, and they will spit out a pretty detailed result, and I have to say, I've tested them and they're quite good. They're not 100% accurate. I have seen errors in them, just to forewarn those listening. You cannot go into these things and expect the recommendation to be fully accurate. You're going to have to validate them. But I can foresee a future where these things get fine-tuned to where, so what is it that advisors are going to do? If now that precision advice market is cornered by or is commodified by LLMs, what is it financial advisors will do? Well, I have to say financial advisors are currently and will continue to provide that human element that AI just simply can't. And here's an example. And it's and I'm not saying, they're going to emotionally cater to you. They're going to hug you at night. Financial advisors don't really do that, although they kind of do. They help you find a good advisor will sit down with you and almost be like a money therapist or even a life coach. I know you do that with your clients, Brent. You do a phenomenal job of just helping your clients figure out what's most important to them. I mean, that is something a Grok can't do that. But even more like basic than that. Let's say this financial advice. I go and I'm getting ready for retirement, and I need to know, okay, well, what should I do with my $3 million retirement account? How should I structure this thing to provide me income? And I go into Grok or Gemini, and I ask it, and it spits out these results. And okay, who's going to help you implement that? That requires action, requires human action. So at some point, the rubber has to hit the road and the wheels have to spin.
Yeah.
You can't just have this calculation and this text. That's all it's doing, is giving you text. It's giving you directions. You need to have someone that actually takes that recipe and bakes it.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned, you talked about the DIY folks before, and DIY is fine. Now, my belief is that DIY investors are actually kind of missing the point. As a DIY investor, it's not that you can, it's the value isn't necessarily that you now don't need an advisor. The value is actually that you have enough wherewithal to sniff out a good versus a bad advisor. You can make sure you hire a good advisor, right? But, kind of thinking about the DIY investor, eventually, as they age, the reality is like it's important to have somebody that can kind of help you, handhold you through this stuff. I one time had a client that told me, he said, there's 2 people in your life that you want to hire younger than you. That's your doctor and your financial advisor. And reason being, because those are the 2 people that are going to help you as you age, right? You don't want to be retiring right as your advisor's retiring. That person's been helping you get ready to retire. And then right as you need them to make that transition, both you and them are out. Same for a doctor, right? As you get into your old age, you've got the needs for the medical issues and you lose your doctor of 30 years because they're the same age. So, you want over time, people do. I mean, I'm sure you do and I do. We both have clients. There's a lot to be said for all this fancy planning and all the stuff that we do. But some clients just simply want somebody that they know that'll pick up the phone and talk to them and help them get stuff done.
Yeah. So that leads me to the next thing that advisors do. And I think DIY investing is great for some people. But I have yet to meet a person who does all their investing on their own that couldn't find value in working with the right financial planner. I think the tendency for people to go full DIY is because they're afraid to waste money. They just don't want to waste money on fees where there's no value added. And I actually completely,
of course,
I empathize with that because as you mentioned, there's a lot of that woman who got given that recommendation to cash in her life insurance to buy, or cash in her retirement to buy life insurance. I mean, it's just like, what? And people hear that and you're like, yeah, I think I'm just going to buy the S&P and call it a day because it's that simple. And it really, the thing is that is actually better than listening to that guy's advice. And how sad is that? But you just haven't found the right advocate, the right plan. There's plenty of really good planners out there that truly would add value. And if your objection is, well, I don't want to pay fees, well, just find a flat fee planner. You can hire me as a flat fee financial advisor. And at the end of the day, if I review your plan and everything's working on all 8 cylinders and there's no way I can add value, guess how much I'm going to charge you? $0, because I did not bring value to the table. Guess how many times that's actually happened? Never. I've always been able to identify some opportunity in a client's portfolio because nobody, not a single person, including myself, by the way, has a monopoly on good strategy. And so for the DIYer out there, and if you're afraid just to make a bad decision or waste money, just call Brent or myself. We'll sit down with you, and I'm sure there's
or just recognize that your strength as somebody that has some financial knowledge isn't necessarily that you don't have to spend all these money on fees, but more so that you can identify the right person. Yeah. And back to the future advice, I hope that we continue. I mean, one of the reasons that we do this podcast is because we want to deliver consumer education. Like, even if you'd never called me or hired me or whatever, if listening gave you some sense of, okay, here's, the right things. If listening to this episode were to give you a sense for, okay, maybe this person is helping with the right things, or I have a good advisor or not, it's important that we continue to educate the consumer on what to expect, because ultimately consumer dollars are what's going to drive change, right? And I think that going back to some of the things that Vanguard's done and some of these other, companies that have commoditized investing, that has been a positive for the consumer because it's pushed the advisory space. There's still lots of change though, and it's an exciting time to be an advisor, because I'll say from the perspective that we have delivering comprehensive advice, there's a lot of opportunity out there for clients to get better help.
Yeah, and I think for you and I, we're not intimidated or afraid about AI and what the future holds in the financial advice space. The fact is, money is so complicated. I hate that it's complicated. Part of me, I follow the Bitcoin community quite a bit. There's this notion that Bitcoin solves everything in the Bitcoin maxi world. And part of me is like, yeah, I wish it were so. I wish money were that simple where, $1 is $1 is $1. And, that $1 today is $1 100 years from now. I mean, only if it were that so simple, where you didn't have to invest, but that's not the world we live in.
I think with you think about the Social Security system, and it's not a surprise to anybody listening to this that's not. I mean, in the best shape.
The IRC alone is enough to hire a good financial planner. It's so complicated to minimize or optimize your tax bill over your family's lifetime. Just that one calculation alone is worth sitting down with an advisor and saying, "Hey, show me how I can minimize my tax footprint."
Yeah, because by the way, CPAs, while they do your tax return and they'll answer the question, how much tax do I owe? There's a difference between calculating tax on a tax return and looking at a period of years and assessing where is income going to go. And so, does that make today's tax rate good?
Yeah,
or bad? So,
well,
anyway,
let me add one story. A good financial advisor is just gonna pivot and react in ways that add value to you and in a way that is unexpected. I have one client, for example, that does a lot of stuff with Vanguard, and they do a lot of DIY stuff. But they also understand that they're the person that is the primary money person in their household. And once they're out of the picture, which, does happen, sometimes you get, sometimes you go before your spouse does, and your spouse is just, not as skilled as you are. You need to have someone that kind of knows where the pieces fit, and what you held out as valuable and didn't, and discounted. And
if you are the main spouse that handles money and your spouse does not handle money, know that if something happens to you, your spouse that doesn't know how to handle money is probably going to go try to hire somebody to help them figure out what to do with the money.
And the risk, and that's
the risk of them hiring the right person.
They're going to hire someone that's not vetted by you. That's the point.
Right. It
may be a bad person. It may be a good person. Who knows? It doesn't matter. They're not vetted by you. They're probably not going to have your values. So you need to pre-shop that. Right. Period. I mean, if you don't see the value in that, then you think you're immoral. And I can't fix that problem. All right. Well, now so that's one example I have. Another example, which is like, I had this one client, I still have him, the family as a client, but is a really good dude. Did a lot of success in real estate, invested in a lot of rental properties. And these rental properties were held in his name. And he fell ill. All right. So the family came to me and they said, well, what do we do with these rental properties? And we look at them and we said, well, how are these registered? Oh, they're in his name. Well, let's quit claim deed them over to his wife's name. I'm sorry, they were in his wife's name. I got it backwards. They were in his wife's name because he didn't want he thought for liability reasons, that was the better route to go. So we quit claim deed them into his name. So that way, when he passed away, step up in basis. We're talking millions of dollars here, Brent. I mean, the amount of tax savings here, astronomical. Guess what Vanguard is not going to do?
Right.
They're not going to do that. Guess what Grok or Gemini is not going to do? They're not going to do that.
Yeah,
That's
an easy change.
Yeah, and it was a fairly easy change. Now, actually, it wasn't easy. We had to deal with an attorney, and we had to file a bunch of paperwork. But it was worth
because
it.
At that point, he
hundreds
wasn't able to
of
do it
thousands
himself.
of dollars saved. I could charge this client. I don't, but I could charge this client my maximum fee for the rest of their lives, and still not even come close to the amount of money they saved just from this one recommendation. Now, that's kind of an extreme scenario, but the point being is that
you don't know what you don't know.
You don't know what you don't know. And if you sit down with a fee-only planner or a fee-based planner and you go over this plan, and by the way, you pay for it after you get the service. All right. So usually you're not paying ahead. Now, that's not always the case. Some do bill in advance, and I don't have nothing against that. But the way we do it here is we bill in arrears. So, and at the end, and if you're not getting any value, you're probably going to recognize that usually in the first consultation. You know, right. I don't think you're going to go down this long road and find out, oh, there's nothing here. Usually find out, and in the worst case is like, you know, use up maybe an hour of your life, but at least you know with some certainty that that you're on the right path. So I think that's a good place to end it. So you and I don't feel that threatened by what there is to come in the future.
Threatened. No, honestly, as young advisors, I mean, I think from our perspective, this is really good. I mean, these changes ultimately benefit the clients and ultimately challenge our industry to do better for people. And that should be a good thing.
And my hope really is that they kind of, they solve some of this wealth gap issue, because there's a huge push. In fact, in this McKinsey article, they're talking about it, where there's really going to be two types of offices. There's going to be the niche planning offices for the high net worth folks. And there's going to be 2 or 3 big firms that are able to capture the mass affluent with, you know, I actually disagree with that. I don't think that's what's going to happen. Because I don't see how our firm is going to die under the weight of the Fidelity and Vanguards of the world wielding these LLMs. It's like ultimately you have to have implementation.
I think these kinds of predictions on the future are never very similar to the idea of the financial plan. They're never exact, right? But directionally, I think they have a lot of good points, right? The advice is getting more comprehensive. The fees are becoming more transparent and more ongoing. The advisor population is getting younger, and people and consumers are demanding more in terms of the level or the amount of value that they're getting. I think those things are going to remain directionally intact. Whether they're correct in some of the minutia and some of the stats, I'm sure we can talk about it. I mean, it's coming faster than you think. There's only 2030 sounded like it was so far away just a couple of years ago. We're halfway there.
Yeah.
I think
that, I think that we're going to see LLMs or AI, it's going to allow our office for single advisors to serve more clients. So I think you are going to see some consolidation. Yeah, for sure.
Well, if you listen to this point, we really appreciate you. Thank you so much. And, anyway, we look forward to continuing to do this for you. And hopefully you continue to get value out of it. So,
all our information is in the show notes. So if you want to learn a little bit more about what we do and how we may be able to help you, just click on the show notes and you should be able to see Brent's contacts, my contacts. Thank you for listening.
To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. Any company names noted herein are for educational purposes only and not an indication of trading intent or a solicitation of their products or services. Advisors associated with National Wealth Management Group may be either 1. Registered representatives with and securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA SIPC, and investment advisor representatives of National Wealth Management Group. Or 2. Solely investment advisor representatives of National Wealth Management Group and not affiliated with LPL Financial. Investment advice offered through National Wealth Management Group, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial.